Calvinism is a system that can be said to be, very strangely, a rationalist system. Now, why would one call this a rationalist system? The reason is because Calvinism is based on the assumption that the Protestant canon is a solitary unit that has been given to mankind by God that contains one unified systematic theology. This is the foundational axiom of the Calvinistic system. So when it approaches the Protestant canon, it approaches it as though it is one book. It is one unified theological system, when in fact the Bible contains a divergence of different theologies. Now, of course, the Calvinists will strongly contest this and try to argue that there is only one unified systematic theology running through all of the books of the canon. The rise of militant Calvinism in our time can be traced back to the work of someone named Rushdoony, but I believe it also hinges strongly on the work of Greg Bahnsen, who walked the same theonomic path as Rushdoony, arguing that the laws of the Old Testament are the laws of God that should be applied to society. So it's very similar to Sharia law, to Islamic law. And many theonomists will actually admit this about their theonomic position. Theonomy is referring to the idea of divine law from God. Now, Rushdoony wrote a multitude of books, but his major work is the 3 volumes of the Institutes of Biblical Law. This is one of the foundation texts of the Theonomic movement. In this text, Rushdoony says that law is, in every culture, religious in origin. Now, he doesn't define religion. He wants it to be this way because he wants to smuggle in his Christianity as being equal to rational and humanistic formations of law. He says, because law governs man and society, because it establishes and declares the meaning of justice and righteousness, law is inescapably religious, in that it establishes in practical fashion the ultimate concerns of culture. I think there's some truth to this. Law's certainly a form of declaration in society, but it's more than this. It's not merely a form of declaration. It's also a form of reasoning. He says, accordingly, a fundamental and necessary premise in any and every study of law must be, first, a recognition of this religious nature of law. Now, what Rushdoony means here by the religious nature of law, in his mind, he thinks about it that anything that occupies a place of ultimate authority within a society thereby occupies a place of religion within that society. I don't think this is necessarily true. I think it's a point that he simply asserts and wants his readers to accept. But nonetheless, he says, second, it must be recognized that in any culture, the source of law is the God of that society. Well, this is what you would expect from a religious extremist. You would expect them to think in terms that anything that has a position of authority within society must occupy the place of being a god. If law has its source in man's reason, then reason is the god of that society. If the source is an oligarchy, or in a court, senate, or ruler, then that source is the god of that system. So the interesting thing about this is that Rushdoony seems to believe, and he wants his readers to think, that he can escape this humanistic aspect of law. Rushdoony wants his readers to think, through special pleading, that his religious position in law gives him a position where he has higher authority, and that he bypasses this mode of reasoning, that he bypasses these other structures that he wants to reject, these humanistic structures. But that is not the case, as will soon become apparent. He says, in any society, any change of law is an explicit or implicit change of religion. Nothing more clearly reveals, in fact, the religious change in a society than a legal revolution. When the legal foundations shift from biblical law to humanism, it means that the society now draws its vitality and power from humanism, not from Christian theism. Here's where his position begins to break apart. And it breaks apart at the fundamental level. So when Rushdoony says that it shifts from biblical law to humanism, it means that society now draws its vitality and power from humanism, not from Christian theism. We have a very significant problem because we have two loaded terms here: biblical law and Christian theism. This is a significant problem. Rushdoony's argument here hinges on us not questioning these loaded terms, not asking for him to explain or define what he means by biblical law or what he means by Christian theism. Now, it will become more apparent in a moment the problematic nature of his position. So he says, in analyzing now the nature of biblical law, it is important to note first, and this is the most important thing about the theonomic position of law. This is the crucial aspect. It is important to note first that for the Bible, law is revelation, i.e., the Protestant canon. What is objectively essential in the Torah, in that early portion of the Bible that was in Judaism, is not the form, but the divine authority. That's very important, because what Rushdoony is doing here is he is simply introducing authoritarianism and making authoritarianism the foundation of law. It's actually worse than this. He is actually ascribing authority to a set of ancient documents, and he's saying that these documents should have supremacy over every form of human reasoning. It's dogmatism, but it's actually worse than this. Because Rushdoony's not just saying that a particular set of documents in the Protestant canon should have authority, but it's more specific. that a particular interpretation of these documents, we talked about Calvinism having a system, the assumption, the axiom that it's one theology contained throughout the totality of the Protestant canon. So Rushdoony has this assumption that the interpretation, his interpretation, let us be clear, his interpretation of these particular documents should occupy the place of highest authority. In Christianity, we are never dealing with a position where something is straightforward. There is always a process of mediation happening where individuals are interpreting, are compiling the documents that make up the Bible, and then they are declaring that these documents have authority. Rushdoony says the law is the revelation of God and his righteousness. So, this Christian position, this radical Calvinism that is emerging, simply hinges on the authority of the Protestant canon. It simply hinges on the idea that whatever the Bible says must be absolutely true. But that's not exactly correct. It hinges on whatever a particular group, a class of Christians, a sect of Christians, a denomination of Christians, however this particular Calvinistic branch of Christianity interprets this canon, that must be the thing that is absolutely true. So it's not straightforward. When these theonomists try to tell us that the Word of God has absolute authority, that's not what they mean. What they really mean is that our interpretation of these particular documents have authority. Now the situation degenerates even more than this. So we can see that this position here that's being put forth in the theonomic case is actually a position of authoritarianism. There's nothing complicated about it. It's simply individuals demanding that their particular declarations of law, their particular premises of law, should have a higher privileged status within the context of society. They do not believe that this is up for a debate, and the way they bypass this deliberative process, which is necessary for deliberative democracy, the way they bypass this is they simply assert that their position is, by its very identity, a position of absolute authority. Now they try to get around this, and any objections to this, by saying that any objection to their position is equally claiming that it occupies a place of absolute authority. And this is not true. We formulate law as best we can, and we change laws based upon new information. The more we know, we begin to alter the nature of our laws because we learn through our experience, through time, that our laws are destructive to the well-being of society, the individuals that make up society. And so our law goes through a reformation process. Now I'm going to talk about the fatal error that lies at the heart of theonomic thinking and presuppositional thinking, as in presuppositional apologetics. So Rushdoony said that law is in every culture religious in origin. And then he said it must be recognized that in any culture the source of law is the God of that society. If law has its source in man's reason, then reason is the God of that society. This is a tremendous problem for theonomy, for Calvinism, for presuppositional apologetics in general, and I will tell you why. If law has its source in man's reason, then reason is the God of that society. But Rushdoony said, when the legal foundations shift from biblical law to humanism, it means that the society now draws its vitality and power from humanism, not from Christian theism. We have a problem, a significant one. What is biblical law? It's law that is said to be derived from the Bible. What is the Bible? Is it one book? It's not. Empirically, it is not one book. It's a multitude of different books that men have brought together. They have compiled these, and they have accepted these as being the authoritative Word of God. Maybe you're beginning to see the problem, but I'm going to spell it out and make it much more clear. So, when the legal foundations shift from biblical law to humanism, biblical law is derived from the Protestant canon. But it's not just derived from one book. It's derived from a multitude of texts, most importantly, as those texts are interpreted. So really what Rushdoony is saying, he is not saying that the legal foundations of biblical law contrasted with humanism, but he is actually saying that the legal foundations of his religious position are based upon a formation of hermeneutics. That this Calvinistic position, this theonomic position, is actually a hermeneutical position, that what is really being argued is that a particular interpretation of a particular set of books is authoritative. So it is not an idea that there is this straightforward declaration of law, but there are interpreters of these books who then declare law. This problem is going to get worse. So Rushdoony says, if law has its source in man's reason, then reason is the God of that society. So it's very important. It's very, very important that Rushdoony's position, that the Calvinist position, that the presuppositional position is not actually based upon reason. This is very important because according to Rushdoony's logic, if law has its source in man's reason, then reason is the God of that society. So it would be catastrophic if Rushdoony's position was actually rooted in its concrete form, not by what he declares it to be, but where its actual concrete foundation is, what its actual axiomatic, eminent structure is. If that structure was found to be a rational structure based on man's autonomous reason, then Rushdoony's entire position on biblical theonomic law would collapse. This is a tremendous problem. So what Rushdoony is doing, he is trying to disguise the fact that he is actually trying to set himself up, and those like him, a particular denominationalism, a particular theological position. He's trying to set up this position in a position of absolute authority over every other position. He is trying to smuggle himself and his kind, his authoritarian kind, into a position of authority. That's what he's trying to do. Because it's not just the Bible. He's not going to accept interpretations of the Bible that contradict his theonomic position. He's going to reject those based upon his hermeneutic, based upon the way he interprets a particular set of books. So what's really going on here is that these theonomists are just trying to put themselves in a position of dominance over the rest of society. They're trying to put themselves in a position of dogmatic authoritarianism, where they do not have any discourse with those who disagree with them, but they simply dismiss these individuals on the basis of authoritarianism. But this continues to get worse for the theonomic position, because as Rushdoony said, if law has its source in man's reason, then reason is the God of that society. Well, if that's the case, we had better make sure that biblical law and that Christian theism do not have human reason at the root. We have to make sure that these entities, the Bible, biblical law, and Christian theism, do not come into existence through a human process of reason. Because if they do, it would mean, as Rushdoony says, that reason is the God of that society, that reason is the God of his position, that reason actually has the highest level of authority within the position he is describing, that the foundation of law is not actually the Bible, but it's actually a rational process that is taking place within the human mind and within human culture. Now enter here the most destructive critic of Christianity to exist in the 21st century. The man who has shattered Christianity at the very foundation. No greater threat exists to fundamentalism than this man. Bart Ehrman. Bart Ehrman used to be a Christian, a fundamentalist Christian. He's one of the greatest biblical scholars of our time, so much so that even Daniel B. Wallace, who is an evangelical scholar, praises Bart Ehrman and looks up to Bart Ehrman. But Bart Ehrman is an atheist, and what Bart Ehrman has done in a multitude of books, like this one, Forgery and Counterforgery, is he has demonstrated that there is no such thing as the Bible that Rushdoony would like to reference, that someone like Greg Bahnsen would like to reference, that someone like Cornelius Van Til, the founder of presuppositional apologetics, would like to reference. But in fact, when we look at the Bible, what we have is a compilation of texts. But we don't even have a compilation of texts, as Bart Ehrman has demonstrated to us. There's no such thing as the single most important copy of the Gospel of John. There's not just one copy of the Gospel of John. There's a multitude of copies of the Gospel of John. And so this very painful question arises to the presuppositional thinker and the theonomic thinker who want to place the Bible at the foundation of all authority in society. And that painful question that these authoritarians fear is, how do we know, with all of these different competing documents, which document is accurate? How do we know which verses are accurate? How do we know which books belong in the canon and which books don't belong in the canon? How do we know which verses belong in a book and which verses were added by scribes. Now we have to be very careful here, because if we're not careful, we will end up demonstrating that reason lies at the very foundation of our thinking about the Bible, that this ideal of the Bible that was said to be the ultimate authority on which all law should be based, on which all rationality should be based, if we're not careful, we run into a very significant problem, and that is that we end up demonstrating that we are functionally using reason to discern what counts as the Bible. But that's a major problem, because according to Rushdoony, if we're using reason at the foundation, then reason becomes our God. And if reason is our God, then we don't have a system of theonomy now, do we? We don't have a system of apologetics based on the authority of the Bible. In fact, the authority of the Bible is secondary to the presuppositional structure, we might say the eminent structure, that lies at the foundation of the architecture. When we go to account for the existence of the Bible, what has to be true in order for the Bible to be true? What brought the Bible into existence? Well, is there a book in the Bible that told us what books specifically belong in the Bible? Is there a book in the Bible that tells us specifically what verses belong in each one of these books in the Bible? There's not. So what was the ultimate criteria that was utilized to construct the compilation of the Bible? How could it be anything other than the function of human reason? And this is a catastrophic blow that shatters the axiomatic foundation of the theonomic and the presuppositional position of Calvinism. It destroys it. And the reason it destroys it is because it demonstrates that the authority that the Protestant canon hinges on, that the authority that biblical law hinges on, that Christian theism hinges on, is not the Word of God, is not the Bible, but it is man's autonomous human reason that has to work with these fragmented texts and has to sift through them on the basis of reason to determine what is authentic and what was written by scribes. And so theonomy ends up falling, ends up shattering on the basis of its own criteria. Bart Ehrman is greatly feared within the Calvinistic circles, and the apologists in Calvinism have gone after Ehrman over and over again because they understand the significance of what happens if it is demonstrated that autonomous human reason exists at the foundation of the Christian position. If instead of it being the Word of God, the blank claim of the Bible, if instead of that, what actually exists, the actual function of authority, is autonomous human reason, then we have a problem. Because as Rushdoony says, if law has its source in man's reason, then reason is the God of that society. Well, what do we call it then when the very existence of the Bible has its source in human reason? Why then should we defer to a book that had to defer to human reason to come into existence? Shouldn't we defer to the authority which is higher, the authority which enabled the existence of this Protestant canon? Shouldn't we defer to this rationality, this process of rationality that humans have gone through to try to compile this text? And so at the end of the day, what this radical Calvinistic theonomic presuppositional position is, this extremist religious position is, it's an unconscious and incompetent form of authoritarianism. It is simply an attempt to smuggle itself to the position of highest power so it can dictate to society through its own interpretation of these archaic books, so that it can impose its extremism, its authoritarianism. But the truth is that there's an authority that's higher than the authority that theonomy appeals to. Greg Bahnsen famously wrote a book on theonomy called By What Standard? And by this he was referring to what standard do we formulate law on? Do we formulate it on the basis of what he would call the Word of God, which is the Protestant canon, or do we use autonomous human reason? And the reductio ad absurdum that is utilized by the presuppositional apologist and by the theonomist is to try to demonstrate that this rationalistic approach breaks down. But the problem is the theonomic position is itself founded upon, defers to the very authority that it tries to disclaim. Therein lies the fatal blow. Therein lies the death blow to theonomy, the death blow to presuppositionalism, the death blow to Calvinism. Because once we establish that human reason exists at the ground floor, there's no good reason for us to leap over to an extremist, fundamentalist hermeneutic, to a particular interpretation of a particular set of books that were themselves constructed and compiled by human reason. Intelligence would tell us, the hierarchical presuppositional order of the process would tell us, that what we should really defer to is human reason, because that, when we examine the architecture, is the foundation that brought this notion of the Word of God, or the Bible itself, into existence.